Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Robin Dwyer.
And I'm Sally Burdett. Our top stories. Hopes of a rate cut in the United States. Inflation hit 3% in June and consumer prices actually fall.
The UK economy grows faster than expected as regulators relax the rules to attract more IPOs to London.
Palestinians flee Gaza City as Hamas warns Israel's latest assault could derail ceasefire talks.
And Kenya's president sacks his entire cabinet after recent deadly protests over tax rises. US inflation has fallen faster than expected, boosting hopes of a cut in interest rates.
The annual rise in the cost of living dropped to 3% in June for the first time in 12 months, with consumer prices actually falling compared to May.
It's the third month in a row that inflation has gone down. Investors and borrowers want the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates, which have been at a near two-decade high since last year.
Well, our correspondent Mitch McCann is in New York and joins us now. Hello, Mitch. So what are the key takeaways from this inflation data?
Well, good afternoon from New York. One of the biggest headlines from this morning's data here in the US is that consumer prices have fallen. In fact, they have fallen for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic, which of course is significant news for all Americans. So if we look at the figures again, consumer prices dropped 0.1% on a monthly basis, helping bring the annual rate of inflation to 3%, down from 3.3% in May, according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now, for context, if we look at this in recent years, much wider, today's result represents a significant drop in CPI over time, which reached a peak, of course, back in 2022 of 9.1%. And the fact prices are falling for Americans is obviously positive news for many. And we are in the middle, of course, of an election campaign here in the US, where prices at both the supermarket and the gas station have become a central issue for voters. And many feel their lives are becoming more and more unaffordable. So they may feel that these numbers are trending in the right direction for them. We've also seen a statement from the US President Joe Biden about these numbers in the last short while, and he says that today's report shows we are making significant progress fighting inflation. He added that wages are rising faster than prices and that his administration has created 15.7 million jobs. So no doubt the state of the economy is a significant consideration for those voters ahead of November's election.
So, of course, the question we've been asking all week is, are we getting a step closer to rate cuts in the US?
Yeah, and that conversation has certainly ramped up after these numbers today. It's important news for the Federal Reserve, who are tasked with making a decision on rate cuts, which, if implemented, are likely to make borrowing money less expensive here in the US. And these numbers make cuts more likely, according to experts this morning. Now, the Fed has a 2% goal for inflation, but its chair, Jerome Powell, has told lawmakers in Washington in the last couple of days it doesn't need to hit 2% to reach that number for rate cuts. Powell told officials you don't want to wait until inflation gets all the way down to 2% because inflation has a certain momentum. And he added if you waited that long, you probably waited too long because inflation will be moving downward, what they don't want. But experts this morning in the US say that that rate cut is more likely now, and the Fed will meet next at the end of this month, where a decision on that could be imminent. So we'll have to wait and see, but more likely to see rate cuts after these numbers this morning.
All right, thank you so much. And Mitch McCann joining us from New York.
Well, that's the picture in the United States. In the UK, the economy grew faster than expected in May, helped by growth in services and house building. GDP rose 0.4%, double the 0.2% that analysts had expected. The strong performance is a boost for the new government, but means the Bank of England may delay cutting interest rates. Let's talk now to Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International, Mark Oswald. Good to see you again, Mark. Thanks for joining us. So looking at these figures, we saw growth double what analysts had expected in the UK. So what's happened?
Well, in part, in May, it above all reflected a recovery from the bad weather impact in April, where GDP had been flat. But what it does is basically keep second quarter GDP on course to repeat that strong performance, well, relatively strong performance of 0.7% in Q1. The strength was above all driven by services such as professional, scientific and technical, a rebound in retail and wholesale, and construction. Both of those had actually been very, very weak in the April report. So there's a little bit of catch-up going on there. As far as the momentum goes, it's stronger than expected, but I always think one needs to keep this in perspective insofar as we've obviously seen this week the Barclaycard consumer spending numbers and the BRC retail sales numbers for June, i.e. the month after, which were weak, both fell in year-on-year terms. So there is a lot of volatility which is weather-induced, and I still feel that underlying everything is some general feeling of cost of living pressures still being there. But with the stability of a new government, perhaps people will feel that things are turning out somewhat better, and that could set the UK economy fair for reasonable growth in the second half of the year.
Well, let's talk about that new government in the UK. The new finance minister has said that economic growth is a national mission. How are they planning to do it?
Well, there are a lot of measures, but in terms of fiscal terms, there's not a lot of room for manoeuvre. They promise not to raise taxes, but the prospect of any tax cuts are not there. They want to increase home building to a pace which, to be quite honest, is not really achievable. They're talking about 300,000 new homes per year. We haven't seen the best level since 1997. And that was the level in this year was 250,000. And for that to happen, they will basically, not only for this, but also for all the things they want to do in terms of speeding up the energy transition, getting private investment mobilized for the energy transition. They really need to speed up the planning process. And that's going to be a lot more complicated. They will also need to see some changes in terms of land use reform. None of this is easily done at speed. So, yes, absolutely admirable. And I think in terms of how they've approached this, in terms of giving the impression of hitting the ground running, by above all having their first cabinet meeting on the day after the election, but at the same time also going through an exercise in expectations management, namely saying we've got a lot to do and there are a lot of difficult choices to make, which there are. Highlights that this isn't, they're going for growth is not something which is going to, there is no switch to flick, there are no fingers to flick to suddenly turn the lights on and the UK economy is going to start outperforming others. It may well outperform a lot of economies in the Eurozone, particularly France and Germany, but that's not really much of a benchmark at the moment, given growth in both countries is very sluggish.
Well, I want to ask you about something else which is looking for growth, which is listings in the UK, IPOs. There's been a big shake-up of the rules to try and make it easier for companies to list on the London Stock Exchange. Why now, and is it going to work?
Well, first of all, this was actually basically something which was outlined by the previous government. Why now? Because there's this feeling that London as a financial centre has to some extent lost a lot of traction, above all to the US, to a certain extent to Asia, simply because Asia is a big growth region. And they want to try and get a piece of the action, above all in the tech sector, to make things more attractive to companies to come and list in London. Nevertheless, I wonder how much success they will have with it. It's certainly something which would be positive for the UK economy, in terms of allowing more companies to float, given that the pool of companies that have floated recently has been very, very meagre.
Mark, good to talk to you as always. Thank you for joining us. That's Mark Oswald from ADM Investor Services International.
The EU has accepted Apple's pledge to open its tap-to-pay iPhone payment system to rivals. This is to resolve an antitrust case and avoid a potential $40 billion fine. The European Commission has previously accused Apple of abusing its position and breaking competition law by limiting access to its mobile payment technology.
The UK's busiest airport will be forced to cut landing fees. Charges for planes arriving at Heathrow Airport will be capped at just over $30 per passenger by 2026. Heathrow had originally pushed for $52 as it tries to recoup pandemic losses. The intervention by regulators follows a lengthy dispute between the airport and airlines.
Shares in Delta Airlines are lower after it reported a nearly 30% drop in second quarter net income of $1.3 billion. Despite strong summer travel demand, Delta said it was hit by higher costs and lower base fares. The airline is also predicting a lower profit than Wall Street expected for the third quarter.
The operator of Japanese fashion giant Uniqlo has raised its full-year net profit forecast for what will be its third straight year of record gains. Fast Retailing says it's on track to make $2.26 billion, up by more than $280 million on its previous estimate. Because of strong sales at home, aided by a surge in duty-free sales from tourists taking advantage of the yen falling to a 38-year low.
China is building nearly twice as many solar and wind projects than the rest of the world combined. This is according to a new study. The report by Global Energy Monitor says 2/3 of the world's wind and solar production is in China. It says the country is now on track to reach 1,200 gigawatts of renewable capacity by the end of 2024. That is 6 years ahead of Beijing's target.
The UK's Energy Secretary has banned new drilling for North Sea oil with immediate effect. The regulator had been due to issue licences to explore new fields, but these have been cancelled by Ed Miliband, who's part of the incoming Labour government. Companies which have spent millions bidding for the new licences could now take legal action.
The German Automotive Industry Association has called on the European Commission to abandon its proposed tariffs on electric vehicles manufactured in China. A spokesperson for the group says the plan would hurt the German market and its car industry.
Well, in general, you got to look at Germany as being a very export-oriented country. Like 3 from 4 cars made in Germany are being exported. In China itself, we have also production that is going to be exported. So the thing is that from the tariffs that are right now being announced, also German manufacturers that are having joint ventures with Chinese manufacturers are affected. For example, they have different models that they build in China that will be exported that are being on high tariffs now. So that, of course, needs to be prevented. That is not a solution. That doesn't make it better for the customer. It will make cars more expensive. And it is, as I said, the start of maybe a conflict that will go broader. So we want to be active on the Chinese market. We want to produce there. And, of course, if Chinese companies want to produce in Europe and build up factories here, that's also okay. I think we all have to always remind us that we have the WTO, the World Trade Organization. We have rules, and we should follow those rules. And whenever there is somebody who's not following the rules, yes, let's talk about it. Let's find a solution. But let's not go straight to the tariffs and start a bigger conflict.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. China accuses NATO of maliciously trying to escalate tension after the alliance accused Beijing of enabling Russia's war effort.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The great transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliette Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back. Residents trapped in their homes, bodies lying in the streets. These are some of the reports coming from Gaza City as Israel pushes on with its latest assault. Palestinians have accused Israeli snipers of shooting civilians trying to leave the city, a day after Israel ordered residents to evacuate.
Hamas says the offensive could derail the latest efforts to end the conflict. Israel describes Gaza City as a dangerous combat zone, saying Hamas fighters have regrouped there. Our correspondent Akram Al-Satari reports from Gaza.
Well, the Israeli occupation forces declared Gaza City as a dangerous battlefield and asked people to move away from it, but it turned out, according to the testimonies and accounts provided by the people who were fleeing for their life, that Gaza City has been turned into a gunning field by the Israeli occupation snipers, by the Israeli occupation tanks, and also by the unmanned drones that were dropping bombs on the people who were trying to flee for their safety and for their own survival. According to the Palestinian eyewitnesses, around 60 bodies have just been retrieved from Ash-Shaja'iyya neighborhood. Ash-Shaja'iyya that saw around 13 days of continuous and relentless fire by the Israeli occupation forces. Like it saw also kind of resistance, a fierce resistance by the Palestinian fighters who were trying to defend the neighborhood and who were there, and most of them were killed, according to the Palestinian forces. Also As-Sabra area and As-Sana'a area, two main areas in the east and the west of the Gaza Strip that has also been witnessing summary killing, according again to the Palestinian eyewitnesses. Around 10 bodies were retrieved from As-Sana'a area. Whole families are trapped, and appealing for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society and the International Committee of the Red Cross for the sake of just identifying their whereabouts and also helping them. But it is evident now they will be facing their fate without any international or local organization able to help them. Throughout the Gaza Strip, also in Gaza Central area, in Rafah and Khan Yunis, there were some incidents that took the life of around 10 or 11 Palestinians in the last few hours. In the last 24 hours, around 50 Palestinians were killed, and it is expected that the number of people killed in this day would be much higher. The destruction of the homes is still continuous, not only in Gaza, in the Shaja'iyya neighborhood or in the Zaytun neighborhood, but also far to the south of the Gaza Strip in Rafah area, where the bombardment is still continuous and the number of people who are killed and injured is still increasing.
That's Akram Al-Satari in Gaza. Meanwhile, the Israeli military says the country has been attacked by several drones from Lebanon, with one person said to be critically injured. Our correspondent Jonathan Regev joins us now from Tel Aviv. So, Jonathan, talk to us about these drone attacks coming over from Hezbollah, I would imagine, in Lebanon.
Yes, Hezbollah has a very large number of drones, and it's using it since the conflict on the northern border began on October 8th. And Israel is finding itself in a problem here, because intercepting these drones and UAVs is turning out to be much more difficult than intercepting the rockets. If the Iron Dome stands at roughly 92–93% of intercepting rockets hits and missiles and rockets fired towards populated areas. As far as UAVs, the numbers are smaller, 60 to 70%. That means that still, when Hezbollah fires tens of UAVs at once, many of them actually make impact and hit, and it's quite a problem. Those drones fly very low, and they spend a short time in the air, as the distance from the place where they're fired from in Lebanon towards Israeli communities is very short, meaning they spend very short time in the air. They fly very low. They're difficult to detect. They're difficult to intercept, and the percentage of those intercepted is far lower than when compared to the rockets. And Hezbollah has learned this quite well. They understand very well that Israel is not able to intercept maybe the majority of the UAVs, yes, but still tens of them make their way when a larger barrage is fired, and it turns out to be quite a problem for Israel.
Yeah, against that context, what's going on in the north, and of course then the IDF's ongoing attacks in Gaza, all the more important for these ceasefire talks to finally bear fruit. Some positive signs from the United States that Israel and Hamas may have agreed a basic framework. Anything official at this stage, Jonathan?
Yes, we've actually heard a statement from the White House coming in the last hour saying that there is progress, that there are positive signs, and things are looking better than they looked in the previous months. This is a statement coming from the White House in the past hour. Of course, such a statement would not have come out unless there was something behind it. We know that there are quite intensive talks over the past few days. There were negotiations in Doha, Qatar on Wednesday, and an Israeli delegation is meant to fly to Cairo for the continuation of those negotiations. We're speaking of two different paths. One is between Israel and Hamas regarding a hostage deal. The other is between Israel and Egypt regarding control of what is known here as the Philadelphia Corridor, which separates the Gaza Strip from Egypt, from the Sinai Peninsula. In both of these paths, as far as we understand, progress has been made. That still does not mean that we will see a deal coming to fruition tomorrow morning. There's still obstacles, there's still differences, especially between Israel and Hamas, and especially on the issue of what happens next, what happens after, for example, the first stage of the hostage deal. Can the negotiations on a second stage go on and on until an indefinite time, as Hamas is asking, or will there be a deadline, as Israel is asking? Will Israel be allowed to continue with the war, or will the ceasefire become permanent? Many questions still to solve, but it seems that there is some progress. This, according to American sources, clearly more positive signs in the sense than we've seen in previous months.
Well, thank you so much for that update, Jonathan Regev there in Tel Aviv.
China has strongly rejected accusations by NATO that it's helping Russia to maintain its military operation in Ukraine. Beijing criticised a draft communiqué from the alliance, saying NATO was hyping up an alleged threat from China and provoking regional tension.
It makes no sense and comes with malicious intent. China's objective and impartial position and constructive role on the issue of Ukraine have been widely recognized by the international community. Without any evidence, NATO has continued to spread false information fabricated by the United States and openly discredited China. This provokes China-EU relations and undermines China-EU cooperation.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Benji Haya, who's in Washington, D.C. So, Benji, what's been happening at the NATO summit?
Well, this is a critical summit, not least because NATO, according to its own comments, say it's facing the biggest security challenge that the pact has faced in its 75-year history. And then you couple that with what is frankly a domestic political crisis here in the United States, with increasing calls for Joe Biden to step down as a nominee and fears, certainly in this room, about what a Donald Trump presidency could bring to NATO. More on that in a moment. The underlying mission for this summit, at least, is to continue that support for another year at least to the war-torn nation of Ukraine. Extra support in regard to air defences. We're told that F-16 fighter jets are already on their way to Kiev. Membership, which is sort of the big prize of President Volodymyr Zelensky, that is off the table for now, but we're having repeated reassurances from the 32 member states of this now expanded defence pact that it will continue to have Ukraine's back as it fights off this Russian invasion. And ultimately, this is also an exercise in future-proofing those commitments against any potential change in the administration, stateside or otherwise. In past moments as well, Ukraine being the discussion, but also plenty of deliberations about what's going on in the Indo-Pacific. This is a NATO... representatives from Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, not necessarily members of this alliance, but there is, I think, a general sentiment being spread here that these sorts of things being discussed about Western security go beyond just North America and Europe, and that these nations need to work together and cooperate to fight off those perceived threats in that part of the world as well.
Well, Benji, I think we've had some problems with our sound to you, so unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. That's our correspondent, Benji Haya in Washington, D.C.
All right, let's move to the story. Representatives from the so-called BRICS nations are in the Russian city of St. Petersburg for a parliamentary forum. Among them is Russian President Vladimir Putin, who spoke at the opening of the event.
BRICS is a grouping of major emerging economies, including China, Russia, India, Brazil and South Africa. Talks will focus on the role of parliaments within international relations. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova reports from Moscow.
Well, the Russian president has sent his warm welcome to the legislators from the BRICS states. He also praised the work of this body. He said it was very important that the lawmakers from the BRICS countries have gathered in St. Petersburg, and he said that these discussions that are taking place are very important for strengthening the international authority of the BRICS countries. He also said that it is possible that in the coming future the BRICS bloc could actually start to have its own parliamentary body. That is obviously the work for the future, but this is the possibility that could be taking place in the years to come as the interest in the BRICS bloc is growing among the international community. The Russian president has also said that the work within the BRICS group is based on the taking into account of mutual interests and the respect of the countries that are members of this grouping. He also said that one of the priorities of the group at the moment is enhancing the economic development for the prosperity of the countries that are member states and that are working with the BRICS bloc. He said that the number of countries that are willing to become permanent members of the BRICS is growing, but at the moment Moscow, as it is chairing the group this year, is working on incorporating the countries that have recently joined the bloc starting the 1st of January this year. So certainly the Russian president has expressed hope that the work of the BRICS lawmakers will only be serving the strengthening of this bloc and its international authority.
And Dasha, Putin's met China's top legislator Zhao Leji on the sidelines of this forum.
That's right, and we understand that the Russian president told him that all the arrangements that have been reached between him and the president of China, Xi Jinping, are slowly and steadily being implemented. He said that was very important. The partnership between Russia and China is important for Russia. He also has said that the work of the legislative bodies of these two countries is benefiting these two states as well as the stability worldwide. He has also said that Chinese president is expected in Russia in October when the BRICS countries will be meeting in the city of Kazan for the Leaders Summit. On his part, the Chinese legislator has also said that the Chinese Republic was also looking at strengthening and deepening ties with Russia, and said that the Chinese people were supporting Vladimir Putin's being elected for the new term. So certainly the very important meeting, yet another one between the officials from Russia and China, that is proving that the two countries do have the no limits partnership and seek to deepen their ties wherever they can.
That's Dasha Chernyshova in Russia. You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, UK households face higher bills, but by how much? As water companies are told to clean up their act.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Sally Burdett and me, Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. Hopes of a rate cut in the United States. Inflation hits 3% in June and consumer prices actually fell.
The UK economy grows faster than expected as regulators relax the rules to attract more IPOs to London.
And Palestinians flee Gaza City as Hamas warns Israel's latest assault could derail ceasefire talks.
Kenyan President William Ruto has dismissed almost his entire cabinet following nationwide anti-government protests.
Demonstrations have been staged across the country against planned tax hikes, which Ruto was forced to abandon. At least 39 people were killed in clashes when protesters stormed Parliament last month. The President announced the cabinet decision in a televised address.
Our correspondent Enoch Sikolia joins us from Nairobi. Hello, Enoch. So we remember these protests. They were deadly. There were calls at the time for Ruto himself to step down, but he sacked his cabinet. Do we know why?
Well, the president says he has been listening to the voice of the people, and the people have had, or we have had, a public outcry in this country where people were protesting. They are protesting against, let's say, what began as a rejection of the finance bill of 2024, which sought to hike revenues, or not revenues, but levies. Now, that has morphed into calls for good governance, calls for the end of fight against corruption and mismanagement of public funds. So it's something that has been boiling down with people making several demands, and especially when we are talking about people, we are talking about protesters, a majority of them being young generation, Generation Z, which have been pushing for changes. They say they've seen quite a lot of public servants, and especially when you're talking about cabinet secretaries, we are talking about members of parliament, and even members of the executive, displaying opulence when things are not working in the country. They're talking about the high rate of unemployment, high cost of living, and just things not working in the country. And so they have been pushing the president. Remember, the protest lasted almost 3 weeks, people going to the streets, and eventually they ended up at parliament buildings where they disrupted parliament proceedings, and especially after members of parliament forcefully passed the bill despite the protest. So it has been a call for good governance in the country. And that is why the president has decided to axe the entire cabinet, save for the deputy president and the prime cabinet secretary.
So what happens now, Enoch? I'm thinking in terms of convening a new cabinet and also tackling that debt that's at the heart of the problem.
Well, when you look at and analyze the speech by the president, he says he's going to reconstitute the cabinet, but which will be more inclusive. Remember, he says that he will have talks with all stakeholders across different fields, even including different political parties. So we are going to see a restructuring of cabinet, which he insists that must be inclusive going forward. Now, for that to happen, there is a whole lot of talks that he has scheduled. Beginning Monday, he will have forums where he will be discussing with various stakeholders, religious leaders. I've talked about the political parties and quite a number of people from different backgrounds to just see how he can reconstitute a better government, a better cabinet, and which includes now the cabinet secretaries that works to deliver for the people. But in the meantime, the principal secretaries, which are principally assistants, or they support the cabinet secretaries in various ministries. In Kenya, we say they are the accounting people in ministries, will take charge until the president reconstitutes his cabinet. So we are going to see a lot of activity in the next coming weeks and months as the president tries to live up to the expectation of the people. He says that Kenyans are expecting a lot from him, and for him to deliver now, he thinks that he needs a team that actually delivers. He says one of the things that Kenyans were mad about was the bloated government, having a lot of cabinet secretaries. Now he says he's going to look at how to thin his cabinet, which means now reducing the number of ministries, some of them which will become departments in various ministries.
All right, thank you so much for that update, Enoch Sikolia in Nairobi.
Britain's water regulator has rejected proposals by water companies to raise bills by a third on average over the next 5 years.
Instead, bills will go up by around 21%, but water companies are being asked to invest less than they had proposed in upgrading infrastructure.
Our correspondent Yolo David is here. So, Yolo, what are the factors at play here?
Well, it's an increase in pollution, it's an increase in water bills at a time of cost of living, which has been for a number of years for millions of people. There's concern about that. But there's also the political drive to have better regulation, better governance, because there's such a widespread pollution problem in so many rivers, coastline areas, lakes and so on throughout especially England and Wales. And also because the water companies are privatised in England and Wales, they're not in Scotland and Northern Ireland, then that has sort of exacerbated the problem in terms of how much money the private companies have to improve a very old, sometimes fragile infrastructure, which was built, actually started by the Victorians in 1860 onwards. So that tells you how old it is, and it's not really fit for extra, more pollution, heavier rain, far more higher population. All this is making the problems a lot harder. So the way that Ofwat, one of the regulators on the water industry, it wants to put up the pricing so much, which will go up every year until 2030. The water companies are saying this is not enough. We can't do any infrastructure, proper infrastructure on this. There is a negotiation now for 6 months. However, I think it is worth saying Thames Water, the biggest company, which has a debt of $23 billion, it still managed to pay over $200 million to some of its shareholders through dividends in March this year. And that's where campaigners and activists are pressurising the last government, and I think this new government as well, that they should really regulate properly, and maybe things would improve.
Yola, a lot of these water companies are owned by foreign investors. How much of this is a bit of a test case for how the new government is going to treat investors?
It could be, because Steve Reed, the new Environment Secretary, was meeting the chief executives of the water companies today, on Thursday. 90% of English water companies are owned by equity, by banks, by private investors. And, you know, I can give an example with Thames Water again, because it is the biggest. It supplies water and sewage for 15 million people in the southeast and in the London area. And yet, you know, it's owned by the Ontario Municipal Employees pension scheme, 32%, 20% by the Universities Superannuation Scheme here in the UK, the USS, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority 10%, China Investment Corporation 9%, and other investors as well. Now, that's not unique. That is true in most of the water companies, especially in England, slightly different in Wales, but still, it tells you that if the investors in other fields feel there's no clarity, if they feel that there's no certainty, if they feel that the regulation and the governance is not being taken seriously, if they see and hear the disgruntlement of people and activists and consumers, they might not feel so sure that there's a risk here with other investments, especially large global investors who the UK government, the new government, are hoping to attract in here. So that's the potential danger.
Yeah, it's a big one. Thank you so much, Yola Abdavid. Now, let's stay with this issue. Earlier, I spoke to Susanna Streeter from financial services company Hargreave Lansdown.
It is a very significant move, actually the first of its kind for a water company, and it just shows how seriously Ofwat is now taking the precarious situation of Thames Water. We just heard earlier this week that the company was able to tap funding for another 11 months, but obviously the clock is ticking and that reservoir of available cash is shrinking fast. Now, there had been high hopes that its investors, including Canadian pension fund and sovereign wealth funds, China and also the Middle East, would actually stump up more money, more longer-term funding, but they held back because there had been this row, really, with the regulator over just to what extent bills could rise, how much money they could get from customers to enable them to invest in repairing the infrastructure that it so badly needs, but also shoring up its financial situation.
The water companies are all meeting with the new Labour government currently. Is this regime that the Thames Water system is under likely to be a bit of a test case for the other companies?
Well, yes, and we know as well that South East Water is facing financial difficulties as well. The other listed water companies are in better shape, but the bosses of all the water companies are meeting with the government. It really wants to try and assess just how fragile other companies are, because there's a massive public outcry over the levels of raw sewage being pumped into the rivers and seas across the UK. The infrastructure is creaking. There hasn't been enough investment. The listed water companies have been under more scrutiny. They have to, of course, publish their quarterly results. They come under a lot more scrutiny. Those that aren't listed, it seems as though there has been a lack of transparency, and they've been highly criticised for allowing debt piles to build up while they've been taking big dividends out of the companies.
How much of the problems facing Thames Water and other indebted water companies is actually about greed and keeping investors happy at the expense of waterways and the consumer?
Yes, they have been highly criticised for the amount of dividends paid out over the years and the lack of investment in infrastructure. And this is why we are currently at this situation where customers are facing increases in their bills. The Labour government said during the campaign, when the MPs were out campaigning, that they were going to get tougher on the water companies. They were going to stop the number of bonuses that chief executives and other executives could get, particularly if their firms were shown to have been consistently leaking sewage into the waterways. It is a very, very difficult situation, though, for the government to deal with, because on one hand, it doesn't want to renationalise these companies. That would be a huge bill for the government to take on. So this is why Ofwat is putting forward this kind of oversight turnaround regime, and we could see the likes of Thames Water being broken up into a number of separate companies, and even potentially parts of the business being listed to try and build up that funding, which is so crucially needed.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Transported to the future. We'll be in the passenger seat of one of China's new robo-taxis.
These people are the lucky ones. These migrants made the dangerous crossing to Europe in a small boat and were picked up by the Italian authorities. Many people who try to reach Europe have to be plucked from the sea when their boat capsizes or sinks.
This boat had around 30 people on board.
Hundreds of people desperately hoping for a new life in Europe. The thing is, there are huge amounts of people in Europe, particularly on the far right, do not want them on this continent.
Thousands of migrants allowed to enter without permission, who end up crowding out the slums of our towns and cities.
Welcome back. Norway's seafood exports dropped last month, in part because of lower salmon prices.
Now, across the country's fishing industry, the focus is starting to switch to less traditional seafood, some of which is popular in China. Our correspondent Johannes Fleshberger reports.
She's not easy to trick.
Greenland halibut is one of Norway's most difficult fish to catch with a rod. But given the saturated salmon market, luxurious halibut meat could be a profit-yielding alternative.
It's a very, very beautiful, tender, white meat that just falls apart. Yeah! You got a small halibut.
Despite the Greenland halibut going under the radar for many, the intensive trawling and angling of the reddish-brown flounder has a great value for the fishermen here on Norway's Lofoten Islands. In recent years, China has grown as a market.
Last year, the Scandinavian kingdom exported 10,000 tons of Greenland halibut to the People's Republic, which makes China Norway's top market for this fish. According to the Norwegian Seafood Council, the country's salmon exports have declined in the past months due to high prices and market saturation, while Norway's famous dried cod remains popular with stable export numbers.
You can store it for as many years as you want. As long as it's cool and dry, you can eat this in 5 years.
Before being dried and turned into stockfish, some of the fresh cod is shipped to Denmark, the UK and China, which are significant markets for Norway's frozen cod. Meanwhile, Ståle is trying to catch more halibut. Time will tell whether the Norwegian flounder can one day reach export numbers like salmon and cod. Johannes Fleshberger, CGTN, Lofoten, Norway.
The Pacific island nation of Vanuatu was one of the first countries in the world to ban single-use plastics. And that move has helped drastically reduce the amount of waste it generates.
But activists warn more work needs to be done to help the country's environment. Greg Navarro explains.
The cleanup crew along the lagoon near Vanuatu's capital, Port Vila, is being led by 14-year-old Cynthia Enoch.
She tries hard to explain to all the other kids
that they got to clean the salt water because the future for tomorrow is for them.
That sentiment is shared by the young people here in the Error community who now pursue a passion for the environment that started nearly a decade ago.
The winds take all the plastics and people throwing rubbish, and it spoils the lagoon, the fish and all the stuff.
Because this is where Vanuatu's work to ban certain single-use plastics started. Community members say much of the waste that transformed their once pristine lagoon was plastics.
Form like a little island. We cannot pick them once. No, we go day after day, and we pull our fishing net just to pick up all this plastics.
Members and environmentalists took their concerns to the government. That led Vanuatu to become one of the first countries in the world to ban certain single-use plastics. Today, supermarkets and stores no longer use plastic bags and hand out plastic straws.
It makes a huge difference because it helps us reduce the number of the plastic.
Those banned items now reportedly account for less than 2% of the country's waste.
Well, there are some restaurants and cafes that now serve food in takeaway containers like this that are biodegradable. Doing so is voluntary. It's not mandatory, which means there are a number of businesses, including some in this market here in Port Vila, that still rely on plastic.
And spend some time in the communities that surround the lagoon and you'll see that single-use plastics are only part of the waste problem. The water is too polluted for swimming.
They're spoiling the fish and the crabs and shells here in the lagoon. When you eat the fish, you get, you shit water, your stomach, you're sick.
Water bottles and other imported plastic items continue to overwhelm waste management facilities and litter the area.
It depends in every mindset of every human life.
Community members say they want the world to know what plastics are doing to their home, and they want the world's help to stop it. Greg Navarro, CGTN, Port Vila.
Robo-taxis are now on the roads in some parts of Beijing with no human drivers.
It's part of a plan to create so-called smarties and modernize China's urban areas. Our correspondent Jung Chunying took a ride.
A taxi without a driver at the wheel. Yes, it's possible. Baidu's Apollo Go is a Chinese autonomous ride-sharing service launched in 2017 in the suburban Beijing city district of Yizhuan or E-Town. Now, these driverless cabs are making advances on road to commercial operation. And today, I'd like to give it a try.
So now all I have to do is to enter the last 4 digits of my registered phone number. And then the door will automatically open. See, no one is inside except for us. So now let's fasten our seatbelts and press the button. Wow, it's moving. Wow.
On the road, the robotaxi made turns, changed lanes to overtake another car, and negotiated its way around the streets. And there's a button that can be used to call for help in case of an emergency. And now, Beijing has allowed many robotaxis, including Apollo Go, to offer such driverless vehicle services at Beijing Daxing International Airport.
Wow, here we arrived safely. It takes us about 10 minutes for 5 kilometers, just as the regular taxi.
From sanitation to security patrol vehicles, buses to delivery cars, self-driving vehicles are becoming part of residents' everyday lives. And all of this is inseparable from China's determination to deepen reforms while achieving greater self-reliance and strength in science and technology. Over the past few years, China has made significant investments in technology, seen in the rising numbers of high-tech talents, contracts, and patents in the field. In 2023, there were 950,000 technology contracts signed, with the transaction volume reaching more than 6 trillion yuan, marking a more than 28% increase year-on-year. The number of authorized invention patents reached more than 920,000, a rise of over 15% year-on-year.
Well, China has an extreme level of innovation. Chinese growth in the future
will be driven by technology and innovation. That's the only solution. And that's how China will really escape the middle income trap, and become a developed nation with a high level of GDP per capita.
Looking ahead, the Chinese government has pledged to allocate 370 billion yuan for science and technology in 2024 as part of its efforts to advance innovation. And Beijing's E-Town is ready to follow the task.
We'll implement more application scenarios for vehicle road collaborative autonomous driving. We'll also accelerate the research and development of core technologies, gather more talents for scientific research, and achieve more scientific research results.
It's hoped the move will not only create more market potential that benefits Chinese tech companies such as Baidu's Apollo Go, but also drive the country's economic growth and better serve people's lives. Zheng Shuiying, CGTN, Beijing.
Well, from the new to the very old, the largest and most complete Stegosaurus fossil ever found is going up for auction in New York next week. Apex, as the dinosaur is known, was discovered in Colorado in 2022. It stands 3.35 meters tall, it's more than 6 meters long, and it's about 70% complete. The remains are expected to sell for between $4 and $6 million, making it one of the most valuable dinosaur fossils ever to hit the market.
And finally, an Estonian athlete has become the first person to cross Italy's Strait of Messina on foot. Jaan Rüüsä traversed a slack line stretching 3.6 kilometres between Sicily and the Italian mainland. The crossing took more than 3 hours, but Rüüsä fell just 80 metres from the finish, meaning he missed out on the world record for the longest slack line.
All right, let's just give you your headlines once more. Hopes of a rate cut in the United States. Inflation hit 3% in June and consumer prices actually fell.
The UK economy grows faster than expected as regulators relax the rules to attract more IPOs to London.
And Kenya's president sacks his entire cabinet following recent deadly protests over tax rises.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching. Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.